The Doomed Logger by Marie D. Henry, copyrighted 1996. Vance Kyle worked as a teamster for the John Benson Logging Company. With his team of matched black Canadians, his job was to haul the logs from the cutting grounds to the holding yard that was located on the banks of the Tiddigush River. There they were piled in huge piles ready to be floated to the mill on the river's rushing waters during the spring drive. Each teamster and his horses were also expected to go to the company's store once a week to get the supplies for the men in the logging camp. Every second week of the month was Vance's turn, but the weather had been so stormy that he was not able to leave that morning as planned. Now it was 10 p.m. and the weather seemed to be not as bad as it had been. January in the woods of New Brunswick can be a test of endurance at the best of times, but this January was proving to be the worst in many years weather-wise. As the men huddled around the barrel-bellied stove in the bunkhouse, the door opened, letting in the biting cold and Mr. Benson. He ambled over and held his hands in the heat of the stove, rubbing them together for several seconds before he spoke. "Good evening, boys." "Good evening, boss," greeted several of the older men. Tom, the foreman, asked, "What is the temperature like out there?" "The temperature is awful. It keeps going down. If it keeps going down like this for much longer, it will make the snow too frosty for pulling." Mr. Benson turned his attention to Vance. "I want you and Dave to go get the supplies in the morning. Pick up the order sheet at the cookhouse." He returned his attention back to Tom and his question about the condition of the snow. Vance looked at Dave, who was sitting across the bunkhouse on the foot of his bunk bed. He saw in Dave's eyes the reflection of his own thoughts. "I hope we don't have to stay at the halfway camp." At 3 o'clock on Monday morning, Vance shook Dave awake. They got dressed in their heavy mackinaws, woolen pants, mittens, and sheepskin-lined boots, and slipped out of the bunkhouse. Outside, the frost burned their nostrils with each breath, and the snow squeaked loudly under their footsteps. Loud bangs from the woods shattered the stillness as frozen branches split away from their tree trunks under the pressure of their frozen sap. The horses pawed the floor and jingled their halter rings as Dave began to harness Bessie. Vance went to Cherry's stall. Dave threw the harness over Bessie's back and looked over at Vance and asked, "Do you think we will have to stop over at the halfway camp? I don't hanker to spend the night there." Vance tightened Cherry's cinch strap. "If it stays clear, we should make it to the settlement before midnight." He backed Cherry out of her stall and led her towards the stable door. Dave followed with Bessie. Once outside, they got the team into the neck yoke and hooked up the traces. Then they drove over to the cookhouse. At 7, the sun came up with reluctance, turning the sky from tar black to steel gray. It was near noon when they passed the halfway camp. It sat peaceful and inviting under the cedars. The stillness of the scene was broken only by the call of a lone blue jay, 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 Jay. Vance looked back at Dave sitting at the back of the sled. I'm starved. Do you want to stop here for lunch or eat at the lunch hole? The lunch hole would be a better place. There is shelter for the horses. If we eat here, we will have to make a place in the snow to boil the water can for tea. Let's go on. It's only about a mile. Dave looked back at the cabin as the horses took them around a bend in the road. I hope we don't have to stop here on the way back. The horses trotted along smartly, and in no time at all they arrived at the lunch hole. Vance turned to Dave. You get the team their hay and oats. I'll get the fire going. Vance busied himself with the firewood always left for this purpose, glad for the work to get warmed up. Within 15 minutes they were seated on the blocks of wood eating heated beans piled on thick slices of bread. The hot tea and food chased the chill from their bones as the roaring fire fought with the cold to get them warm on the outside. It danced and crackled, spraying the frosty air with hot sparks. Bessie and Cherry munched the hay Dave had put in front of them. At 1 o'clock they resumed their trip and arrived at the company store at 8 that evening. The clock buzzed its way into Vance's dreams. He turned over in his bunk thinking he was still in the bunkhouse. It took a few seconds for him to shake off sleep and remember that he was in the sleepover room at the company store. He pushed back the blankets and called, Dave, get up, come on, chum, it's 3 o'clock. Yeah, I'm coming, Dave mumbled from under his blankets. Vance did not wait for Dave to get dressed. He stepped out into the darkness of the early morning. The cold struggled to get through his heavy clothing. Bessie and Cherry greeted him with knowing whinnies. He gave them their hay and oats and began to give Cherry her brush down. He was glad that the company clerks had loaded the sled with their order during the night. As soon as they had breakfast and the horses finished eating, they would head back to camp. The hovel was warm with the horses' heat. The sun rose bright and clear at 7, but by 9 clouds raced in from the east. Noon stop was just long enough to feed the horses and to boil water for tea to wash down their cold lunch of peanut butter on thick slices of bread. By 1 o'clock the wind was mourning in the trees and slashing them with heavy snow. Vance shouted to Dave, We'll have to stop at the halfway camp. The horses will never make it right through to camp in this deepening snow. Dave hunched down into his mackinaw as Vance's words whipped past him in the teeth of the wind, taking with them his hope that they would not have to stop over night at the halfway camp. Daylight had long surrendered to the storm when they arrived at the halfway camp. They settled the team in the hovel and fought their way in deep snow to the cabin's door. Dave removed his right mitten and ran his cold fingers along the top of the doorway until they found the key hidden in a crack between the logs. He put it into the lock and twisted it to the right. Vance's voice just behind him sounded like a whisper in the roar of the wind. Hurry up, I'm freezing. The lock is frozen. I can't get the key to turn. He dug into his pants pocket for a match and scratched his thumbnail across its head. It flared into flame. He cupped it in his hand and held it against the cold metal of the padlock. It burned for a few seconds before the wind blew it out. He tried the key again. The lock opened. He hesitated. Vance reached past him and pushed the door open and pushed Dave into the dark cabin. He stopped at the door and held up the lantern he carried and looked around. In its dim light he made out the stove, a pile of wood next to it, and two bunk beds ready for use. Dave swatted the snow from his shoulders and pant legs. He stood just inside of the still open door and watched Vance hang the lantern on a nail over the stove. Vance turned around and invited, "Well, come on in and shut the door." He turned back to the stove and began to fill it with wood. They sat on the lower bunk up and waited for the fire to heat up the cabin. It was not long before the stove was red hot and they had to remove their heavy clothing. Vance set about making supper. They ate in silence. The fried eggs and potatoes along with bread and peanut butter. The hot tea helped to warm them on the inside as the heat from the stove warmed their cold fingers and toes. The warmth of the cabin and the comfort of the hay mattresses tried to lure Dave into restful sleep, but every time he dozed off, he would awake with a jerk to lie listening to the sounds of the storm. Finally he went to sleep, only to awake to silence. Without thinking, he called, "Vance, Vance." Vance's answer came from the upper bunk, muffled by the blankets over his head. "What's the matter?" "The storm has stopped, and I think I hear someone coming." The woof woof of snowshoes stopped at the door. Vance jumped down to the floor and whispered as he looked for his boots, "Light the lantern, quick." Dave quickly struck a match, lit the lantern, and handed it to Vance, who stood ready to open the door. He stood listening for more sounds, but there was only silence. Vance reached for the latch and yanked open the door. There was no one outside. From where he stood, Dave could see that the snow had not been disturbed. Icy chill crept up his back as Vance slowly closed the door and turned to look at him. Vance moved over to the stove. He opened the stove door and put dried chips on the still hot coals. Then he laid wood on top of them. He blew on the coals until they flamed up and took hold on the dried chips and began to lick at the wood. He closed the stove door and turned to face the closed cabin door as David's terror-filled voice almost drowned out the sound of someone again approaching. "There is someone out there." "Shh! I hear it." The woof woof of snowshoes in the deep snow came up to the door and stopped. The latch rattled.